Rebecca had been running her family farm for 15 years when everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, and she was out feeding the chickens when the mailman handed her a thick envelope. The kind that always means trouble. She wiped her hands on her jeans and tore it open right there by the mailbox. Her heart sank as she read the letter. Some homeowners association she'd never heard of was claiming they had authority over her property. They wanted her to get rid of her animals, tear down the barn her grandfather built in 1952, and pay $75,000 in fees. And she had 30 days to do it all, or they'd throw her off her own land. Rebecca actually laughed out loud at first. It had to be some kind of mistake. Her farm had been in the family since 1950, long before any of those fancy houses popped up along her property line. She'd watched those developments go up over the last 5 years, turning farmland into neighborhoods with names like Riverside Meadows and Sunset Estates. But her land, that was hers, free and clear. She tossed the letter on the kitchen table and went back to her morning chores. The cows needed milking, the horses needed hay, and she had tomatoes to pick before the afternoon heat set in. But that letter kept nagging at her. By lunchtime, she picked it up again and read it more carefully. The language was full of legal terms she didn't quite understand. Something about rezoning and jurisdictional boundaries and covenant compliance. It was signed by someone named Patricia Kensington, president of the Riverside Meadows HOA. Rebecca had never met this woman, never even heard her name before. She decided to ignore it. Surely once they realized their mistake, they'd leave her alone. She had enough to worry about without adding fake legal threats to the list. But 3 days later, a silver Mercedes pulled up her long gravel driveway. Rebecca was fixing a fence post when she saw it, completely out of place among her tractors and hay bales. A woman in a cream-colored pantsuit stepped out, careful not to get dirt on her expensive shoes. Behind her came 2 men in dark suits carrying briefcases, and another man with surveying equipment. The woman walked up with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Patricia Kensington and said they needed to talk about Rebecca's property. Her voice was sweet as honey but had an edge to it that made Rebecca's skin crawl. Patricia explained that due to some recent rezoning, Rebecca's farm now technically fell within the boundaries of their homeowners association. Rebecca tried to argue, pointing out that her farm had been there for 70 years. She showed them her deed, her tax records, everything proving the land was hers long before any HOA existed. Patricia just kept smiling that cold smile. She said property values in Riverside Meadows had been dropping because potential buyers didn't want to live next to a working farm. The smell of animals, the noise of tractors, the sight of old barns. It was all bringing down their investments. She actually used the word eyesore to describe Rebecca's home. The 2 lawyers with her started talking over Rebecca, throwing around legal terms and citing obscure county ordinances. The surveyor was already walking her property line, taking measurements. Rebecca felt like she was being ambushed on her own land. She stood her ground, though, told them she wasn't going anywhere, and they had no right to tell her what to do with property her family had owned for 3 generations. Patricia's smile finally dropped. She looked Rebecca up and down, took in the work boots and dirty clothes, and said something Rebecca would never forget. She said times were changing, and people like Rebecca needed to understand that progress was coming whether they liked it or not. Cedar Valley was becoming upscale, attracting wealthy families who expected a certain standard. A working farm didn't fit that vision anymore. Then Patricia delivered the real blow. She said if Rebecca didn't comply with their demands, they'd see her in court. And if she thought she could win against their team of lawyers with her small-town attorney, she was fooling herself. They had money, connections, and the backing of some very influential people in the county. After they left, Rebecca sat on her porch steps for a long time, just staring at the fields. Her daughter came home from school and found her there, the legal papers scattered around her feet. The girl asked what was wrong, and Rebecca tried to explain, but how do you tell your child that someone might take away the only home she's ever known? That evening, Rebecca called her older brother. He'd moved away years ago to become a sheriff in the next county over. They didn't talk as often as they should, but they'd always been close. She needed advice, maybe even help, though she hated to ask. The call went to voicemail. He was away at some law enforcement conference, wouldn't be back for a week. Rebecca left a message trying to keep her voice steady, explaining the situation with the HOA. She asked him to call when he got a chance, Said it wasn't urgent, but she could use some guidance on what to do next. She had no idea how wrong she was about it not being urgent, and she definitely didn't know how quickly things were about to spiral completely out of control. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She kept going over everything in her mind. How could an HOA just claim authority over her property? How was any of this legal? She'd paid her taxes every year, maintained her land, never bothered anyone. Her farm wasn't hurting anybody. But she also couldn't stop thinking about what Patricia had said. About money and lawyers and influential people. Rebecca was just a farmer. She had some savings, but nothing like what it would take to fight a long legal battle. Her lawyer was a good guy who'd helped with her divorce and her will, but he mostly handled wills and small disputes. Could he really stand up against whatever team Patricia would throw at her? The farm had been her whole life. Her parents had worked this land and their parents before them. Every field had a memory. The old oak tree where her dad had pushed her on a swing. The barn where she'd hidden as a kid. The pasture where she'd taught her daughter to ride a horse. How could someone just take that away? How was that even possible in America, where people were supposed to have property rights? But Rebecca had heard stories. She'd read articles about HOAs gone wrong, about people losing their homes over paint colors or grass height. She'd always thought those stories were exaggerated, that people must have done something to deserve it. Now she wondered if she'd been wrong, if maybe the system really could be stacked against regular people who didn't have money or connections or teams of lawyers. She finally fell asleep just before dawn, exhausted and worried. When she woke up a few hours later, she made herself a promise. No matter what happened, she'd fight. This was her land, her home, her family's legacy. Nobody was going to take it without one hell of a battle. 2 weeks went by, and Rebecca started to hope maybe the whole thing would just blow over. Her lawyer had sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA, explaining that they had no jurisdiction over her property. She hadn't heard anything back, which she took as a good sign. Maybe they'd realized their mistake and moved on. She was in the barn one morning, bottle feeding a calf that had been rejected by its mother, when she heard vehicles coming up the driveway. Multiple vehicles. The rumble of engines carried across the quiet farm, and something about it made her stomach drop. Rebecca set down the bottle and walked outside. 3 black SUVs were rolling toward her house, moving slow and deliberate like something out of a movie. They parked in a line, blocking her driveway completely. Her truck was trapped in the garage. The doors opened and people started getting out. Patricia Kensington emerged from the middle vehicle, dressed like she was going to a business meeting instead of a farm. Behind her came several men wearing what looked like security uniforms with badges clipped to their belts. They had the walk and attitude of cops, but something felt off about them. Last out was a man in a cheap suit carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself as a county official, though Rebecca didn't catch his name. Her heart was pounding too hard to focus on details. Patricia walked up with that same cold smile and handed Rebecca a stack of papers. An eviction notice. Official-looking stamps and seals covered the front page. Rebecca's hands started shaking as she tried to read it, but the words kept blurring together. 48 hours. That's what it said. She had 48 hours to vacate the property or face forcible removal. The document cited a bunch of county ordinances she'd never heard of and referenced the HOA's amended bylaws. It looked legitimate. Too legitimate. Rebecca tried to speak, but her mouth had gone dry. How could this be happening? This was her home. You can't just kick someone out of their home with 2 days' notice. That's not how America works. That's not how any of this works. Patricia stood there with her arms crossed, clearly enjoying the moment. She said something about how the farm had been a blight on the community long enough, about how Cedar Valley was moving forward, and Rebecca could either move with it or get left behind. The way she said it, so casual and cold, made Rebecca's blood boil. But what could she do? The men with badges were standing behind Patricia, hands resting on their belts like they were ready for trouble. The county official was already walking around the property, taking photos with his phone. Rebecca felt trapped, helpless, like the whole world had suddenly turned against her. She asked to see more documentation, to understand how this was legal. The county official showed her more papers, more stamps, more official-looking signatures. He spoke in that bureaucratic monotone, explaining procedures and ordinances and legal precedents. None of it made sense to Rebecca, but it all sounded very official and very final. Inside the house, Rebecca's daughter was watching through the window. The girl had stayed home from school that day with a cold, and now she was seeing her mother surrounded by strangers trying to take away their home. Tears ran down her face as she pressed her hands against the glass. Rebecca saw her daughter, and something inside her broke. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her child's home, her future, her sense of security. What kind of mother let someone just take that away? She asked Patricia what it would take to make this stop. Was there a way to negotiate? Could she pay the fees in installments? Surely there was some compromise that would let them stay while they figured this out properly. Patricia's response was ice cold. She said the time for negotiation had passed. Rebecca had been given 30 days and had chosen to ignore the warning. Now there were consequences. The HOA had been very generous, very patient, but their patience was exhausted. The property needed to be vacated, period. One of the security guards started taking pictures of the barn, the animals, the tractors. He was documenting everything like they were already planning to bulldoze it all. Rebecca felt sick to her stomach watching him. She excused herself and went inside to call her lawyer. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial. When he answered, she tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out in a jumbled rush. He told her to slow down, to send him photos of the documents, to not sign anything. Her lawyer looked over the papers remotely while Rebecca waited on the phone. The silence stretched out forever. Finally he spoke, and his voice was grim. The paperwork looked legitimate. Real stamps, real signatures, real legal language. He said it would take at least a week to properly challenge this in court. Maybe longer. They'd need to file motions, request hearings, build a case. Legal stuff takes time, but Rebecca didn't have time. She had 48 hours. Her lawyer promised to start working on it immediately. He'd contact the county, verify the documents, file an emergency motion if possible. But he was honest with her. He said if these people had gone to this much trouble to create seemingly legitimate paperwork, they probably had resources and connections he couldn't match. He was a small-town lawyer who handled wills and property disputes, not some big-shot attorney who fought HOAs. Rebecca hung up feeling more helpless than ever. She looked out the window and saw Patricia still standing in her driveway, talking on her phone and laughing, actually laughing. Like this was all some kind of game to her. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Rebecca tried calling her brother again, but his phone went straight to voicemail. He was still at that conference, probably in meetings or training sessions with his phone turned off. She left another message, more desperate this time, explaining that the situation had escalated and she really needed him to call back as soon as possible. But he didn't call. The hours ticked by and her phone stayed silent. That evening, Rebecca started packing. She didn't want to, felt like packing was giving up, but what choice did she have? If those men came back in 2 days ready to physically remove her, she needed to have their important things ready. Photos, documents, family heirlooms, stuff that couldn't be replaced. Her daughter helped her pack, crying the whole time. The girl kept asking why they had to leave, why those people could make them go, why nobody was helping them. Rebecca didn't have good answers. She just kept saying it would be okay. They'd figure something out, everything would work out fine, but she didn't believe it herself. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep at all. She sat on the porch in the darkness, looking out over the fields. The same fields her grandfather had plowed. The same land her father had worked until the day he died. The same home where she'd raised her daughter, buried her parents, built her entire life. How could it all just end? How could some HOA president with money and lawyers just take it all away? She thought about fighting back physically, refusing to leave no matter what. But those men had badges and authority, or at least what looked like authority. If she resisted, they'd arrest her. Then her daughter would end up in foster care or with her deadbeat ex-husband. That couldn't happen. She thought about going to the media, but who'd care about one farmer losing her land? This stuff happened all the time. People lost their homes to banks, to the government, to HOAs. It was sad, but it wasn't news. She thought about running, packing up in the middle of the night and disappearing. But where would they go? This farm was all she had. Without it, she had no income, no home, no way to support her daughter. Every option led to the same place. Defeat. As the sun started to rise on what might be her last full day on the farm, Rebecca made a decision. She wouldn't make it easy for them. If they wanted her gone, they'd have to physically remove her. She'd stand on that porch and make them drag her off, kicking and screaming. Let the neighbors see. Let everyone know what Patricia Kensington and her HOA were really like. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all she had left. Her dignity and her defiance. She fed the animals one more time, wondering who would take care of them after she was gone. She walked through the barn, running her hands along the old wooden beams her grandfather had raised. She stood in the garden her mother had planted, now overgrown but still producing tomatoes every summer. 48 hours was almost up. Soon they'd come back, and Rebecca would be waiting. The morning of the deadline arrived cold and gray. Rebecca hadn't slept at all. She'd spent the night on the porch, wrapped in her father's old jacket, watching the driveway. Waiting. Around 9 in the morning, she started hearing them before she saw them. Car engines, lots of them, coming down the rural road toward her property. Then she saw the line of vehicles. News vans with satellite dishes on top, personal cars. More black SUVs. They started gathering at the end of her driveway like vultures waiting for something to die. Word had gotten out somehow. Maybe Patricia had tipped off the media, wanting everyone to see her victory. Maybe one of the neighbors had called the local news. Either way, there were cameras now. Lots of them. Rebecca's daughter came out and stood beside her mother on the porch. The girl was wearing her best dress, the one she wore to church. If they were going to be thrown off their land, she wanted to look dignified. Rebecca squeezed her hand, trying to be strong for her. More vehicles arrived. Curious neighbors. Some of the people from the Riverside Meadows development, probably coming to watch the show. Rebecca recognized a few faces from town. Some looked sympathetic. Others just looked curious. Some seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. Then the silver Mercedes appeared, followed by more black SUVs. Patricia Kensington stepped out wearing sunglasses and a designer outfit, like she was attending some fancy event. Behind her came her lawyer and a man wearing what looked like a deputy's uniform. But Rebecca had lived in this county her whole life. She knew most of the deputies, at least by sight. She'd never seen this man before. His uniform looked right, but something about him felt wrong. The way he carried himself, the way his badge sat on his belt, even the way he walked. He didn't move like real law enforcement. The man introduced himself as Deputy Morrison through a megaphone. His voice echoed across the farm, theatrical and overdone. He announced that eviction proceedings would begin in exactly 1 hour. Any attempt to resist would result in arrest and prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. Rebecca felt her daughter's hand trembling in hers. She wanted to run inside, lock the doors, pretend none of this was happening. But running wouldn't help. They'd just break down the door. The crowd grew larger. Maybe 50 people now, all watching and waiting, some filming on their phones. The news cameras were rolling. Rebecca felt exposed, vulnerable, like her entire life was being turned into entertainment for strangers. Patricia walked closer to the porch, staying just far enough back to be safe but close enough to make sure Rebecca could hear her. She said something about how this could have been avoided, how if Rebecca had just been reasonable, cooperative, none of this would be necessary. She made it sound like Rebecca was the problem, like she'd brought this on herself by being stubborn. Rebecca wanted to scream at her, wanted to tell everyone watching that this woman was trying to steal land that didn't belong to her. But what good would it do? The cameras would just show an angry farmer losing her temper. They wouldn't show the injustice, the corruption, the way the system had been twisted against regular people. Morrison and his team started moving closer. They weren't rushing, taking their time, clearly wanting to give Rebecca a chance to leave voluntarily before they had to remove her by force. The news cameras followed their every move. Rebecca's mind raced. She thought about barricading the door. She thought about calling the real police. She thought about her brother, still unreachable at that conference. She'd left him so many messages. Why hadn't he called back? Morrison was almost to the porch steps now. He was reading from a card, reciting legal language about authority and compliance and consequences. His hand moved toward the radio on his belt, probably ready to call for backup if Rebecca resisted. And then, like something out of a movie, everyone heard it. Sirens in the distance, real sirens. Not the fake authority of Morrison's theatrical performance. The distinctive wail of law enforcement vehicles approaching fast. The crowd turned to look. A sheriff's department SUV came racing up the road, lights flashing, moving so fast it kicked up dust and gravel. It didn't slow down until it was right there, pulling into the driveway so hard the tires squealed. The driver's door flew open and Rebecca's brother stepped out. He was still wearing his travel clothes, jeans, and a t-shirt, clearly having driven straight from wherever he'd been. His hair was messy and he looked exhausted, but his eyes were blazing with anger. He shouted one word that cut through all the noise and confusion. One word that made everyone freeze exactly where they were. Stop. His voice carried the weight of real authority. The kind of authority that comes from years of actually serving the law, not pretending to. Morrison's hand dropped away from his radio. Patricia's smug expression faltered. Even the crowd went quiet. Rebecca's brother walked straight toward Morrison, his badge clearly visible on his belt. The real badge, the one that actually meant something. He moved like a man who knew exactly what he was doing and wasn't going to be stopped by anyone. He stopped right in front of Morrison, so close they were almost nose to nose. His voice was quiet, but somehow everyone could hear it. Let me see your credentials, deputy. The way he said deputy made it clear he didn't think Morrison was any such thing. There was challenge in his voice, suspicion, the tone of someone who'd caught a lie and was about to expose it. Morrison's confidence evaporated. He fumbled with his wallet, trying to pull out some kind of ID. His hands were shaking. Rebecca could see sweat on his forehead even from where she stood on the porch. Her brother took the ID and examined it for maybe 5 seconds. Then he looked at Morrison with an expression of pure contempt. He turned to the actual deputies who'd arrived with him and said something that made Rebecca's heart soar. Arrest this man for impersonating a law enforcement officer. The crowd gasped. Cameras swung toward Morrison as real deputies moved in. He tried to protest, started saying something about being hired to do a job, but they were already putting handcuffs on him. His fake badge hit the dirt as they led him away. Patricia's face went from smug to pale in about 3 seconds. She started backing toward her Mercedes, clearly trying to make a quiet exit, but Rebecca's brother called out to her. Ma'am, I'd suggest you stay right where you are. I have a lot of questions for you. Her lawyer, who'd been standing beside her the whole time, suddenly decided he needed to be somewhere else. He started walking quickly toward his car, trying not to look like he was fleeing. But Rebecca's brother called out to him too. Counselor, I wouldn't leave if I were you. The district attorney is going to want to talk to you about your role in all this. The lawyer froze. He looked like he was weighing his options, trying to decide if making a run for it was worth the consequences. Finally, he turned around and walked back, shoulders slumped in defeat. Rebecca's brother addressed the crowd, his voice calm and professional. He explained that he'd been contacted by his sister about some questionable legal documents. On his drive back, he'd made some calls. Real calls to real county officials and real judges. He said the eviction notice was fraudulent. No court had issued any order. No legitimate county official had signed off on anything. The whole thing was a scam, an intimidation tactic designed to scare Rebecca into abandoning her property. More importantly, he'd confirmed with the actual county surveyor that Rebecca's farm was completely outside the jurisdiction of any HOA. The property lines were clear, documented, and undisputed. The farm had been there 70 years before the development was even planned. The HOA had no authority over her land whatsoever. Some of the crowd started murmuring. The neighbors from Riverside Meadows looked shocked. Some looked angry, probably realizing they'd been lied to about property values and blight. Others just looked embarrassed to have been part of this. Patricia tried to speak up, started saying something about mistakes and misunderstandings. But Rebecca's brother shut her down with just a look. He told her she had the right to remain silent, and maybe she should use it until she'd talked to a real lawyer who wasn't about to be disbarred. The news cameras captured everything. Patricia being questioned by deputies, Morrison being loaded into a patrol car, the lawyer trying to explain his involvement, all of it broadcast live or recorded for later. Rebecca stood on her porch, her daughter beside her, hardly able to believe what was happening. 1 minute she'd been about to lose everything. The next minute her brother had shown up like some kind of hero and torn apart the whole conspiracy. He walked over to her, and she saw how tired he looked. He'd driven all night, probably breaking speed limits and running on nothing but coffee and determination. All because his little sister needed him. She started to thank him, but he pulled her into a hug before she could get the words out. He held her tight and told her he was sorry he hadn't been there sooner. Sorry he'd been out of reach when she needed him. Sorry she'd had to go through any of this. Rebecca cried then, all the fear and stress of the past weeks pouring out. Her daughter joined the hug, the three of them standing there while the crowd slowly dispersed and the news vans packed up their equipment. Patricia was led away in handcuffs. The sight of her in the back of a patrol car, her expensive outfit crumpled and her makeup smeared, gave Rebecca a fierce sense of satisfaction. Justice wasn't just coming, it was here. The next few days felt like a dream to Rebecca. After years of quietly working her farm, suddenly she was in the middle of a media storm. Every news outlet in the state wanted to interview her. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters showed up at her gate asking for comments. The story had everything people loved: a bullied underdog, corrupt officials, family loyalty, and a dramatic rescue. Her brother spent most of that first day at her kitchen table, going through all the documents Patricia and her people had given Rebecca. He made calls, brought in investigators, started pulling apart the whole scheme piece by piece. What they found made Rebecca's blood boil. Patricia hadn't just targeted her. There were 3 other property owners in the area who'd gotten similar threats. Small landowners, people with property that predated the development, folks who didn't have money for big legal fights. Patricia had bullied all of them into selling their land at rock-bottom prices. One was an elderly man who'd owned a small horse ranch. He'd gotten so scared by the legal threats that he'd sold out for a fraction of what the property was worth. Now he was living in a tiny apartment in town, his horses sold off, his life's work gone. When he heard what happened to Rebecca, he came forward with his story, tears running down his weathered face. Another was a young couple who'd been trying to start an organic farm. They'd taken out loans, invested everything they had, and then Patricia had hit them with fake violations and fees. They'd fought for a while but eventually gave up, sold at a loss, and moved out of state. They were still paying off debt from the whole ordeal. The third was a widow who'd inherited her husband's property. She'd been so intimidated by Patricia's lawyers that she'd signed over the deed without even consulting anyone. Afterward, she'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone what happened. She thought she was just stupid and had made a terrible mistake. Learning it was all a fraud gave her the courage to speak up. Rebecca's brother worked with the district attorney to build a case. It turned out Patricia's scheme went even deeper than anyone had realized. She'd bribed a real county official to help create the fake documents. She'd paid Morrison and several others to pretend to be law enforcement. She'd even forged signatures from a judge who'd retired years ago. The lawyer who'd worked with her had known everything. He'd helped draft the fake ordinances, prepared the fraudulent paperwork, and advised Patricia on how to make everything look legitimate. He'd done it for money, lots of it, taking a cut from each property Patricia acquired through intimidation. As the investigation unfolded, more details came out. Patricia wasn't just some HOA president on a power trip. She owned a development company that stood to make millions if she could acquire more land cheap. The HOA was just a front, a way to claim authority she didn't have. She'd planned to develop the properties she stole, flip them for huge profits, and move on to the next opportunity. The whole thing was calculated, methodical, and completely illegal. Criminal charges came fast. Patricia was hit with fraud, conspiracy, bribery, extortion, and half a dozen other counts. Morrison got charged with impersonating an officer and conspiracy. The lawyer faced disbarment hearings while also dealing with his own criminal charges. Even the county official who'd helped them was arrested. The local news ran the story every night for a week. Rebecca watched herself on TV, still hardly believing it was real. They interviewed her neighbors, some of whom admitted they'd complained about the farm to the HOA. Now they felt guilty, realizing they'd been manipulated into becoming part of Patricia's scheme. Rebecca's brother made sure the story got to national outlets too. He wanted everyone to know what had happened, wanted other people dealing with similar situations to understand they weren't alone. Within days, the story was everywhere. News websites, social media, even some late-night talk shows mentioned it. People started sending Rebecca messages of support. Farmers from across the country shared their own stories of being bullied by developers or HOAs. Regular folks sent donations to help with her legal bills, even though she told them she didn't need the money. They sent it anyway, hundreds of people contributing $5 or $10 each, wanting to help. The donations added up faster than Rebecca could track. Thousands of dollars, then tens of thousands. People set up fundraising pages without even asking her permission. The money kept coming in from all over the country, from people who'd never met her but felt connected to her fight. A week after the confrontation at her farm, Rebecca attended a court hearing. Patricia was there in an orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd stood in Rebecca's driveway threatening her. She wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. Her fancy lawyer had dropped her as a client, so she had a public defender scrambling to deal with the mountain of evidence against her. The judge denied bail. Too much risk that Patricia would flee or tamper with witnesses. She'd be sitting in jail until trial. Rebecca felt a grim satisfaction watching her get led away in handcuffs. Morrison pleaded guilty almost immediately. He admitted to everything, said Patricia had paid him $10,000 to pretend to be a deputy. He'd done similar work for her before, intimidating people into compliance. He got 2 years in prison. The lawyer fought the disbarment at first, claiming he'd just been doing his job representing a client. But the evidence was overwhelming. He'd knowingly participated in fraud, created fake legal documents, and helped steal from vulnerable people. The state bar stripped his license. His criminal trial was scheduled for later that year. Rebecca's lawyer, the small-town guy who'd seemed out of his depth at first, became a local hero too. He'd been the one who'd kept pushing, who'd insisted something wasn't right about those documents. He'd contacted Rebecca's brother when he couldn't reach her, making sure someone in law enforcement knew what was happening. His persistence had saved Rebecca's farm. The judge in Rebecca's case issued a permanent injunction against the HOA. They were forbidden from ever contacting Rebecca again or claiming any authority over her property. The county officially confirmed that her farm was outside any HOA jurisdiction, and always had been. Her property lines were surveyed and documented beyond any possible dispute. The other victims started getting justice too. The elderly rancher filed a lawsuit to get his property back. The young farming couple were suing for damages. The widow wanted her land returned. Patricia's development company was being liquidated to pay settlements. Patricia's fancy development, Riverside Meadows, started falling apart. Once people learned about the fraud, property values actually did drop, ironically. Some residents tried to sue the HOA. Others just sold and left, not wanting to be associated with the mess. The half-built sections of the development sat abandoned, a monument to Patricia's greed. Rebecca's daughter went back to school as something of a celebrity. Kids wanted to hear the story, wanted to know what it was like to almost lose their home. Teachers used it as a lesson about justice and standing up for what's right. The girl handled the attention with surprising grace, more confident now after seeing her mother refuse to back down. Her brother stayed for 2 weeks, making sure everything was settled before heading back to his own county. Before he left, he and Rebecca sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the fields just like they'd done as kids. He told her he was proud of her, for standing her ground, for not giving up even when everything seemed hopeless. She told him she couldn't have done it without him, that he'd saved everything. He just shrugged and said that's what family does. You show up when it matters. The donations people had sent, now totaling almost $100,000, gave Rebecca ideas. She didn't need that much money for legal bills, so she started thinking about how to use it to make the farm better, to secure her daughter's future, maybe even expand a little. She bought new equipment to replace the aging tractors her father had left her. She renovated the barn, fixing the roof that had leaked for years. She invested in better fencing, more efficient irrigation, even a small farm stand at the end of her driveway where she could sell fresh produce and eggs. The farm that Patricia had called an eyesore started attracting visitors. People wanted to buy from the woman who'd stood up to corruption. Families brought their kids to see the animals and learn about farm life. Local restaurants started buying her organic vegetables and grass-fed beef. Business was better than it had been in years. Rebecca finally felt like she could breathe, like the future wasn't just about survival anymore, but about actually thriving. 6 months after that terrible morning when Morrison had shown up to evict her, Rebecca held a celebration at the farm. A thank you to everyone who'd supported her. Her brother came back for it, along with the other victims who'd been freed from Patricia's schemes. The elderly rancher brought his horses, back in his possession after a legal settlement. The young farming couple drove in from their new property in a neighboring state, back in the farming business thanks to lawsuit damages. Hundreds of people showed up. Neighbors, supporters, news people, complete strangers who'd followed the story. They grilled burgers, played music, let kids pet the animals. It felt like a community coming together, celebrating not just Rebecca's victory but what it represented, that regular people could still win, that bullies could saint. The trial came 9 months after that day Rebecca almost lost everything. The courtroom was packed. Rebecca sat in the front row with her daughter on one side and her brother on the other. Behind them were the other victims, the neighbors who'd supported her and dozens of people who'd followed the story from the beginning. Patricia sat at the defense table looking small and defeated. Prison hadn't been kind to her. The designer clothes and perfect makeup were gone, replaced by a plain outfit and the tired look of someone who'd stopped sleeping well. Her new lawyer, another public defender, looked overwhelmed by the mountain of evidence against her. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Fake documents, witness testimony, financial records showing the bribes and payoffs. Morrison testified against Patricia in exchange for a reduced sentence, explaining exactly how the scheme worked. The corrupt county official did the same, describing how Patricia had paid him to create official-looking paperwork. The jury heard from the elderly rancher who'd lost his horses, from the young couple who'd gone into debt fighting her, from the widow who'd signed away her property in fear, and from Rebecca, who described standing on her porch watching strangers try to steal her family's land. The defense tried to argue that Patricia had genuinely believed the properties were under HOA jurisdiction, that she'd relied on bad legal advice, that she'd been trying to improve the community, not hurt people. But the evidence was too strong. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Patricia showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She just stared straight ahead, maybe finally understanding that actions have consequences. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed again. The judge allowed victim impact statements. The elderly rancher spoke about losing the horses that had been his life's work. The young couple talked about the debt and stress that had nearly destroyed their marriage. The widow described the shame she'd felt, thinking she'd been stupid when really she'd been victimized. Then Rebecca spoke. She talked about her grandfather building that barn with his own hands, about her father working that land his whole life, about teaching her daughter to farm on the same soil 3 generations of her family had tended. She talked about the fear of losing it all, the helplessness of watching strangers try to take what wasn't theirs. But she also talked about hope, about how her brother had shown up when it mattered most, about how strangers from across the country had sent money and support, about how her community had rallied around her, about how justice, even when it takes time, is still possible. The judge listened to everything. Then he addressed Patricia directly. He talked about the trust people place in authority, in official-looking documents, in people who claim to be acting within the law. He talked about how she'd violated that trust, used people's respect for the legal system against them, turned order into a weapon. He sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison. No chance of parole for at least 7. Restitution to all the victims. Forfeiture of all assets acquired through her schemes. When she got out, she'd be past 60 and have nothing but the consequences of her choices. Patricia's lawyer asked if she wanted to appeal. She just shook her head. What was the point? Everyone knew what she'd done. The evidence was overwhelming. An appeal would just drag things out and cost money she no longer had. As they led her away, Patricia looked at Rebecca one last time. Not with hatred or defiance, but with something that might have been regret, or maybe just resignation that she'd finally been caught. Rebecca didn't look away. She met Patricia's eyes and saw for the first time something human there, someone who'd made terrible choices and would spend years paying for them. Outside the courthouse, news cameras captured Rebecca and the other victims. They didn't celebrate exactly. There wasn't joy in seeing someone go to prison, even someone who'd hurt them. But there was relief, closure, the sense that the world had been set right again. The story made national news one more time. Rebecca gave a few interviews, then politely declined the rest. She'd said what needed saying. Now she wanted to get back to her life, to her farm, to normal days that didn't involve lawyers and cameras. Life did return to normal, mostly. The donations had stopped coming in, but Rebecca had enough to make real improvements. She'd hired a part-time worker, a young guy from town who wanted to learn farming. She'd started a CSA program, where people paid a subscription for weekly boxes of fresh produce. She'd even begun hosting school field trips, teaching kids where their food came from. Her daughter, now more confident after everything they'd been through, helped with the farm stand on weekends. She'd seen her mother face down bullies and win. She'd learned that standing up for what's right might be scary, but it's always worth it. Those were lessons worth more than any amount of money. Rebecca's brother visited more often now. Twice a month he'd drive over, help with whatever needed fixing, sit on that porch and watch the sunset like they'd done as kids. They were closer now, bonded by what they'd survived together. He'd tell her stories about his work, and she'd tell him about the farm. Simple conversations, the kind families have when they're just enjoying each other's company. The Riverside Meadows development never recovered. Too much bad publicity, too many lawsuits, too much damaged reputation. Eventually, a nonprofit bought the land at auction and turned it into affordable housing. Young families, retirees on fixed incomes, people who needed a break moved in. The community Patricia had wanted to build for wealthy people became a place for regular folks instead. Some of those new neighbors became Rebecca's customers. They'd stop by the farm stand, buy her tomatoes and eggs, tell her how glad they were to live near a real working farm. Their kids played with the animals while their parents shopped. Slowly, relationships formed. Community grew. The elderly rancher got his property back through the settlement. He was too old to run a full ranch again, but he kept a few horses, gave riding lessons to local kids, lived out his remaining years on the land he'd worked his whole life. He and Rebecca became friends, two survivors who understood what they'd almost lost. The young farming couple settled their lawsuit and used the money to buy property in the next county. They started over with their organic farm, and this time it thrived. They sent Rebecca Christmas cards every year with pictures of their growing family and expanding operation. Sometimes they'd drive over to trade tips and share equipment. The widow got her land back too. She didn't want to live there anymore, too many bad memories, but selling it at fair market value gave her enough money to retire comfortably in a little condo by the beach. She sent Rebecca a thank you card with a photo of herself smiling in front of the ocean. She'd found peace after everything. Patricia's lawyer lost his license permanently. Last Rebecca heard, he was working as a paralegal somewhere, making barely minimum wage, his reputation destroyed. The county official who'd helped Patricia went to prison for 3 years, his career in public service over forever. Morrison served his 2 years and got out. He sent Rebecca a letter of apology, which she read once and then threw away. Some things don't need forgiveness or response. Some people just need to live with what they've done. A year after the trial, a local news station did a follow-up story. They came to the farm, interviewed Rebecca, surrounded by her animals and crops, showed how the donations had been used to build something better. The story ended with Rebecca and her daughter working together in the garden, 3 generations of family history visible in the old barn behind them. The reporter asked if she'd do anything different, knowing what she knows now. Rebecca thought about it for a moment. Then she said no, because fighting back had taught her daughter courage, because standing up to bullies had shown her community that resistance was possible, because refusing to give in had created something better than what existed before. 2 years after almost losing her farm, Rebecca stood in the same spot where Patricia had threatened her. But now, instead of fear and uncertainty, she felt gratitude for her brother who'd driven through the night to save her, for the strangers who'd sent support, for the legal system that eventually worked the way it was supposed to, for the community that had rallied around her. She'd learned that ordinary people could face down power and corruption and win. That family meant showing up when it mattered. That justice might be slow, but it was still real. That bullies only win when good people give up. Her daughter joined her, now helping run the farm stand most days after school. The girl had learned those lessons too, learned them young enough that they'd shape who she became. She'd grow up knowing her mother had protected their home, their heritage, their future. She'd grow up believing in fighting back. The farm was thriving now, more customers than ever, better equipment, a reputation not just for good produce but for representing something larger. Every tomato sold, every egg bought, every visit to the farm stand was a small victory, a reminder that they'd survived, they'd won, they were still there. Rebecca's story inspired others. She got letters from people across the country facing similar battles with HOAs, developers, corrupt officials. She couldn't fight their battles for them, but she could tell them what she'd learned, document everything.